David Armstrong. Fantastic. Thank you very much for this talk. We are very interested in your professional history, and maybe you can start just telling us a little bit about the milestones you had in your development, and then we can later on talk more about group relations and other stuff if you want.
Well, I mean, I suppose I read, my background professionally is I read philosophy at Oxford, and then I decided I wanted to enter psychology. I didn't want to stay on in philosophy, and I moved to Cambridge and read psychology at Cambridge, and was interested always in social psychology, but in those days at Cambridge it wasn't really part of the syllabus. You had to muck it up for yourself, more or less, not entirely, more or less. And I wondered what to do thereafter. I didn't want to stay on at university. So I asked my professor. I got various ideas. I might go to the States and work with a guy called Alex Bavelas, who was working on group formation and leadership. But it was not. It was slightly put off because it was a very mathematical approach that I wasn't really interested in. And a professor, who was a guy called Oliver Zangwill, said there's only one person and one place it's worth considering if you're interested in developing sort of interest in social psychology, and that's Eric Trist at the Tavistock Institute. So I went up to the Tabby to see Eric, and I met him and I think Ken Rice and one other person, I'm not quite sure who now. And basically Eric said, well, if you do okay in finals, you could join us as a junior project officer, working on a series of programs they were then developing on really socio-technical work, but it was concerned with the impact of automation on working structures and work organisation within industry. And I did okay, so I came to the Tabby. This was immediately after I'd graduated in the summer of '59. And I basically worked with, under Eric Trist's leadership. He was then the chair of the Tavistock, but he was also heading up this programme of work. And I worked with Hugh Murray, and then with Eric Miller when they had got an agreement from Richard Thomas and Baldwin's, which was the one public-owned iron and steel industry, to do a study of the building of the Spencer Iron and Steel Works in South Wales, which was a new iron and steel works on a greenfield site, in which they were going to be introducing the latest sort of automated technology, both in production and in sort of quality control, etc. And they had recruited management to come in 2 years in advance of the startup in order to be able to rethink the whole way in which they operated as a factory, basically. So that was the brief. It was not consultancy, it was research. It was action research in a way, in the sense that we were constantly feeding back stuff to management, but it wasn't action research in a sort of strong sense. In a way. And I was there for 2 years. And then came back to the Tavistock. Now, while I was there, the first split took place within the Tavi, when they divided into 2 groups. It took place because Trist had gone on a sabbatical to Palo Alto, to the Institute of Palo Alto in the States, and in the interim Ken Rice had taken over as acting chair. And Rice wanted to really change the structure of the place in a way that was managerially stronger. And Eric felt that it was, how do I put it? It was a move back from the very sort of collegial, quasi-democratic structure of the Tavistock from its foundation. and he was clearly opposed to it. There's also a personal stuff because there was some sort of feeling that Ken was trying to take over from Eric. And I don't know what the details were of the reservations that Ken had about how Eric sort of operated. And there were all sorts of discussions that included some of the younger staff then that were pretty heated, and you could see that the main lines of difference were between Eric and Fred Emery on the one hand, and Rice and, not so much Eric Miller, but I think probably Ken Rice and Cyril Sofer on the other. Anyway, the outcome of this was that they split into two groups. The Centre for Applied Social Research, it was headed up by Ken, and the Human Resources Centre that was headed up by Eric.
Both in Britain? Or?
Yes. But and in fact, it was funny because although there were these two subgroups, and they operated independently within the overall institute, but no external people could ever understand what the difference was. But internally, I mean, there were clearly lines of difference because when I came, this happened while I was in Wales, because Eric was constantly going up, sometimes at weekends, sometimes during the week, for the discussions between the core group of staff about what was to happen. And when I came back, I can remember the younger people were asked to decide which of these two groups they wanted to have an allegiance with, and to really visit each group in turn during their sort of meetings. And I can remember visiting Ken's group, which was let's see, Ken, Eric, John Hill, and market guy who'd come in, whose name I can't remember, Cyril Sofer, and Pierre Turquet, and Isabel.
Francis?
Yes. And Eric's group was Eric, Fred Emery, Harold Bridger, Alex Pollock, Girth Higgin, probably one or two others, I'm not sure, but they were the sort of core people. Eric, I mean, we didn't know this at the time, but certainly Harold felt that Eric was very distressed by Isabel moving into Ken's group, because apparently she had told Eric that she wanted to stay with him, and then clearly at the last moment she changed. You couldn't get much sense of what the difference was, although they rationalised it a little bit by saying, and it wasn't entirely rationalisation, that Eric's group was more the social psychologists, as it were, and Ken's group was more the psychoanalytically oriented anthropologists. I think in a way it's slightly misleading because Eric's group contained analysts anyway, but there was something in it. Of course, the other thing that was lie behind the split, I think, was the dispute between Ken Rice and Harold Bridger about who should head the group relations element. Because Bridger had reservations about the complete focus on the here and now, and he came up with this double task idea. And there was a great deal of bitterness between Eric and Ken, more so than I think probably with any other pairing during the thing. Anyway, so that happened. I came back from Wales and continued working on the programme, and one or two other things. There was some work that we did on the employment of scientists as between industry, the universities, and research institutes, and what were the factors that led scientists to opt for one or the other, and what were the implications in terms of the situation in the UK at the time, when there was a wish to recruit more scientists into either the public sector or into, of course, industry. So I can remember doing that. And then there was a major project on national economic planning, or national planning basically, that was started by a guy called Bertram Gross in the States. And he put together a kind of international and multidisciplinary team with people in each country who were looking at what that country's take was on national planning. and he'd asked Eric to take part in that, and I worked with Eric on the sort of UK bit, and there was Michel Crozier in France, Zygmunt Bauman from Poland, which was then still, of course, communist, and Zygmunt was still there. Bertrand Gross himself in the States, two guys from India whose names I can't quite remember. It was a man and a woman, who were husband and wife, effectively. And they held a extraordinary 1 month long conference in the States, in the Adirondacks, where people shared what was emerging from the different countries, and there were discussions about it, and visiting speaker Maslow came and various other people.
1 month?
Okay, 1 whole month, yes. You could take your family, and you lived on these little cabins by the lake. It was an extraordinary event. And so that all that was happening. The next really headline, though, was when Ken Rice had organised this group relations event, non-residential, based at the Institute buildings in Leicester Street, which lasted for 4 months, and it consisted of weekly evening sessions, which included a small study group, application groups, and lectures, and then 2 weekends which were for intergroup events, the same, each intergroup event in the same model, with staff available as consultants but not planted, and members sort of having to form into groups themselves, etc., etc. And Rice had organised quite a coup, because he got Beaumont to agree to come back and take a group. And I approached Eric to say, there'd been an opportunity to work in a group with Beaumont, and would it be okay if I thought I had to do this because he was the other group. And Eric said, yeah, of course. So that was really the only time I worked closely in something organised by the other group. Now that was hugely important, less so in some ways immediately, more so subsequently. Partly because I've written about this, but I was intrigued by, well, you couldn't but be intrigued by Beaumont. I mean, both physically, because he was very impressive in a way physically, but also by his extraordinary stance. I mean, one talks about neutrality, but I think it's Isabel that said that Ken Rice once described Beaumont as he'd never met anybody that so stood behind his faith as Beaumont did. And it's true, he was, it wasn't that he was cold, but you never really got any sense of what might be going through his mind, or what he was sort of feeling when things were sort of happening within the group. So that was extraordinary in its own right. And the second thing that was extraordinary was that, I'd read experiences in groups, and there were 1 or 2 other psychologists in the groups, from prisons and etc. and elsewhere who had. The group itself was mixed, because there were industrialists, bankers, people from the public sector, psychologists, a couple of people from the TAVI, the more junior people on the TAVI, etc. So some of us had read experiences in groups, but Beaumont never gave the slightest indication that he'd written the book. He never said anything that linked in any way to basic assumptions, etc. You had a feeling that he was in some quite different place, and I think it was a place that later was the place from which he developed some of the more psychoanalytic ideas. So naming, thinking, lying. I mean, wouldn't necessarily use those terms, but later, when I'd read some of that early work, you could see that that's where he was coming from. So you were intrigued in a very sort of striking way, and I think that's what first got into me in terms of sort of group relations world. Although I wasn't at all immediately planning to move into that sphere whatsoever. And then later, I thought of going into, and I had hoped to go into analysis with Beaumont. I then decided to enter analysis. I ought to say that when I joined the Institute, I was totally uninterested in psychoanalysis. Because of the emphasis in philosophy in Oxford. I was extraordinarily sceptical about it. I had no real belief in it, etc., etc., etc. But because the institute and the clinic were very close, and although you were staff at the clinic, you were at the institute. If you asked, you were invited and encouraged to go to case discussions, to look at the Turkey taking a group through a one-way screen, to attend some meetings at the clinic, etc. So I gradually began to get a feel of psychoanalysis and was intrigued. I wouldn't say more than that, I was just sort of intrigued. So anyhow, at one point I decided I did want to enter analysis, also personal reasons, I have to say. And asked Isabel who she thought I might approach, and she said, well, and whether I might approach Beaumont. She said, of course. Why didn't you just write and ask Richie? So I went to see him he'd moved then to St John's Wood. I was living in Croydon, moved to St John's Wood and out of Harley Street, so he was then working, consulting from St John's Wood. And I can still remember knocking on the door and entering the hall. And the first thing I noticed was, I'm not sure I got this quite right, but on the wall were they were really hunting pictures, like jollocks. And I was ushered into a waiting room, which was right next door, obviously, to the consulting room. And it must have had a very thin wall, because I could hear him talking. And the one word that I heard him say, or maybe it's the patient who said, I don't know, was ending. Anyway, when he came in, it was only about 5 minutes, and he came into this other room, and he asked me various questions, but the questions again were not what you might expect. For example, I said something about what my background was. He asked me, had I ever seen fighting?
Physical fighting?
No, in the war. Yes. Yes. I can't remember exactly how that cropped up, but he was. I managed to say that I'd done national service. I did national service in the Navy. I learned Russian, but he was obviously, that was one of the things he wanted to know. Anyway, at the end, he said he would certainly be willing to take me as a patient, but he hadn't got any vacancies at the moment, and he would let me know as sort of things developed. And I waited and waited and waited 1 year, and then virtually sort of 2 years, and then I was in the little pub just opposite the Institute building in Devonshire Street with Eric Trist and Fred Emery. It was just before Eric went off on sabbatical to the States, I think, or no, maybe he'd come back. No, yeah, he did come back. And I heard them saying that Beaumont was intending to go to live in the States. And it was a very strange conversation, because they said Eric had said to him something about Ronnie Lamb was going to be there at the same time, and he might be interested because of what Ronnie Lamb's sort of more recent writings. Divide Itself came out just after I joined the Tabby, and The Self and Others shortly afterwards. And Beaumont simply said, should I read him? So, as if he'd never really had any contact with Lang, although Lang was in training as an analyst when Beaumont was already at the Institute. Anyway, so I panicked, and I then wrote to Beaumont. I'd done some hunting around about alternatives, and I said I hadn't heard, and I wondered what was happening, and I wondered if it wasn't possible. I named 2 people that I thought I might approach, and I got this funny letter from Beaumont, which unfortunately I've lost. It was only about sort of 4 or 5 pages, handwritten, saying, thank you for writing. My plans have now changed, and I'm not able to take any more patients in the UK or something like that. But I think both of your suggestions would be admirable. To that effect. So that was the next thing, and then I went into analysis about a year before I left the Institute. And I left for one I think was because I felt I was getting stuck. It was not I think I felt I was getting stuck as much for personal reasons as anything else, which I won't go into. But and then I was asked by friends that I knew at Oxford whether I'd be interested to join. He was then working at Chelsea College, what doesn't exist now, but is part of the University of London. Now it's joined with King's. And they wanted somebody to come in and do a 5-year action research program on student failure and withdrawal. Because the rates of failure and withdrawal were quite high, but they were very varied between different sort of subject areas. And I applied, was interested, and applied. I think Directorship, who then had left to the States, but I must have written to him to ask whether he would be a referee, and he was very cautious. He said, I'm anxious that you don't get caught in, as it were, particularly a part of a university that isn't, you felt he was saying, that isn't really amongst the elites. Something like that. Anyway, I did, so I applied and I went and was there for 5 years, recruited another psychologist, but she was an anthropologist come psychologist who worked with me, and it was a sort of senior research fellow post. And it was really a study of the single institution, but it was designed as action research in the sense that I fed back what was emerging to a sort of steering group in terms of what might be the implications in terms of the way in which the college was functioning. Well, I can't say too long to go into the details of it. And I was there for the project lasted 5 years, and then I was asked whether I'd stay on and teach, continue in doing research as I wanted, but also teach some social and some developmental psychology to master's students in social work and to training teachers. And it was when I was working with student teachers that I began to get re-interested in groups. I mean, I think when I was doing, that's another interesting event. After I'd entered analysis, I was asked by a friend I'd known from Cambridge who was at the Maudsley and about to enter psychoanalytic training, whether we might together, because the Maudsley and the TAFE were in those days always at loggerheads, whether we might recruit ourselves a group of people from the Maudsley, from the TAFE and from the university who would be interested to come together as a small study group. And I agreed, as we talked about it, and I said, what I could do was to ask to see, or for us to see Bob Gosling, who was then the chair of the professional committee of the TAFE, to ask whether he would be willing, or if not, somebody else he could recommend to work with us as a consultant. And so we went to see Bob, and he said, I'm really too busy to do this. Why don't you approach Isabel? So we went to see Isabel, and Isabel said, yes, she would agree, that we would do the recruiting of the membership, and the fee we agreed with her, which I'm not quite sure how it evolved, was just £1 per person per session.
So more symbolic.
Yes, but £1 was more than it is now, of course, there, but it was sort of symbolic, really, it's quite right. And we would to meet in the evenings once a week with gaps, breaks, for an indeterminate period of time, and it to be reviewed after weeks or whatever. Now, this became known as the group that would never end, I gathered, because people would leave, sometimes in sort of high dudgeon because they didn't disagree, sometimes more gently. And so there was always a preoccupation with, we're too small now, can we recruit new members? And we then went about trying to recruit new members. But Isabel also recruited people from the TAFE. So I can know that she asked Herbert Hahn whether he'd like to come, but he couldn't, etc. So we continued for about, I should think it was about 18 months to 2 years, until it was clear that it would come to the end of it. But the interesting thing was that it had come to the end partly because quite a number of people in the group had found other ways of getting access to Isabel, either the supervisor or whatever. And I got into difficulties with my analyst because I was going 5 times a week, and when this cropped up, the time was the time that ordinarily I would go to analysis. And I asked him whether we could change the time, and he said no, he didn't think we should change the time, but if I wanted to go, I wanted to go, and just work with him 4 times a week, but I'd pay him 5 times a week. So
it was a small study group work?
Yes, it was entirely small study group. And Isabel, I mean, she worked in a much straighter way than Beaumont. I mean, it was very clearly sort of linked to the Beaumont's conceptions, though she was very, very flexible. So that continued. Anyway, with that apart, I really didn't take up any interest in the group sphere much, a little bit, when I was at the university, until I began working with student teachers. And that's when I came across the work of John Bazalgette, because he had written a very interesting book called Freedom, Authority and the Young Adult, which I'd read because I thought it might be relevant to. And I was very, very interested in it, intrigued by it. It was a very good book, actually, written very much from his own experience, and without being as lumbered as later people writing the Grub were by Bruce Reed's ideas. It was very much John's work, and of course John had worked as a teacher. I wrote to ask, I think we both wrote to ask whether John would come and talk at the college to the sort of probationary teachers about this work, because it seemed very radical at the time. As a result of that, I began to get sort of more interested, and a colleague of mine and myself at the college, for working as teachers, decided that we would start a small study group for student teachers, simply sort of working on our own. So we began. Then I realised, well, you know, I want time to get a little bit more training in this. And John wrote me a letter asking whether I'd be interested in a Tavistock conference. Well, it was one of the conferences that were held in September, not April, jointly at Leicester by the TAVI and the Grubb Institute.
Jointly?
Yeah, jointly. And again, it was a sort of, I can't remember, I don't think it was exactly 2 weeks, but it was certainly sort of 8 or 9 days. I'm not quite sure exactly the length. And this was in 1978. Eric was directing.
Eric
Miller, John Bazalgette and Jean Hutton were on the staff, Gordon Lawrence, Robert Gosling, a guy called Dennis Rice. I was in the small study group with him, he was very good, and Nana McCoffin from Ireland. And it was a kind of classic Leicester conference, basically. We discovered, well, except that there were also medium groups and very small groups. You had to opt for one or the other. And I opted for my colleague opted for the medium group. We agreed one of us would go to each, so we could then compare notes.
How many people, members, medium group?
I think it was something like, I've got to be a bit careful, I'm not sure entirely. I think it was something like 20, 25, something like that. Yes.
So
yes. More than 12.
More than 12.
And less than 30. I think so.
30 is the
I'm not sure that it was as rigid as that, but it was something around that area. And the very small group was 5 or less.
5 or less.
And I think there were 5. And I opted for a very small group, and the consultant was Bob Gosling. And that was also very interesting and quite important for me. There was a tremendous, in those days, conferences were much more, in some ways, much more radical. I mean, one thinks of all these innovations now. There wasn't so much the innovations of the kind that happen now, but they were much more radical in terms of how members behaved. Much more turbulent, much more, I can remember an occasion when they were about, the consultants were about to enter the large group, or they must have gone to look at the large group beforehand. They can't have been right on the dot. But they discovered that somebody had come in and piled all the chairs, one on top of the other, on an enormous tower in the middle of the room. And somebody had to go and get a ladder, and then they had to climb up the ladder to take these chairs down. And even when they came down, it wasn't possible to put them in the spiral because there really wasn't time. So and all the members could see what was happening. They never discovered who'd actually done this. Then another member, and this I think we did discover, was constantly changing the time on the clock, conference clock. And then I can remember an event when in the application groups, which towards the end of the conference, there were a group of women that refused to go to the application groups to which they were assigned and set up their own application group on the role of women in organisations.
And asked for consultant?
Yeah, they weren't given it. You know, they were felt.
They were, because outside the bar.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
So they just simply worked on their own. So that kind of turbulence is something that rarely happens now in quite that way. But I think, this is the 70s, I suppose, and it was still revolution. Anyway, and then immediately after that was over, John wrote to me to say that the Grub had got a 3-year action research project called Transition to Working Life, TWL, working with young unemployed.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of this was to work with, now we talk about executive coaches, long before this, they'd come up with the idea of a working coach. But a working coach was not a professional person. The working coach would be somebody from industry or the public service or whatever, maybe working as a shop steward or as a foreman or a supervisor, or maybe an ordinary sort of frontline worker who was willing to work with a group of young unemployed people at trying to help them to begin to feel their way into very difficult circumstances. Youth unemployment was very high then, into working life. And they would be supported by the research staff who would work with them as a kind, and I think we called it an advisor. It was not a supervisor, but it was an opportunity to talk through what had been happening in the group and how the working coach was thinking, etc. And just without taking away his authority to really run this group, have a way of enabling him to think a little bit about what lay behind what he was proposing. And it worked in London, Wolverhampton and Glasgow. And we were responsible for liaising with companies and firms to try and get people who would be willing to work as working coaches or with unions. And then...
when you worked with them, were the members also there, or did you take them out to work?
No, we worked with them after the group.
After the group?
Not immediately,
Okay.
It might be, yes. And the groups almost all worked in premises that we found for them, or that the industry releasing the person also found for them.
They got money for this, or
no?
So it was voluntary.
It was a
social work.
Absolutely, yes.
Very
they got no money
concept.
at all. Yes, it was. And so that lasted for 3 years, and I worked at the London end of it. Nana Cochran worked in the Scottish end, and Jean Hutton in Wolverhampton. And I think, to be fair, Jean's was, and the way in which she worked it was absolutely remarkable in a sense, in terms of liaison with businesses and in terms of recruiting people, etc. Jean was miles ahead of the rest of us. But I really, I enjoyed that. It lasted for about 3, maybe 4 years. And during that time, I began, immediately I joined the Grub. Bruce asked whether I'd go with him be one of the staff members on the Grub conferences, which were held in January in Cambridge. Bruce Reed, who was the head of the Grub. So I'd begun working in groups then. In this, well, actually, that was the first time I'd worked as a consultant in groups, working in the large study group with Bruce and a guy called Andrew Schmidler, who later worked quite a lot with Olya Khalili and Eric Miller.
When was it? It was
that would be 78.
78.
No. 78 was when I went to Leicester. When did I join the Grupp? It would be 79, I think. Leicester might have been 77, round about that. So immediately I joined after.
So Leicester was a member there, you remember?
Yes.
And then
yes. And in that conference, there weren't many people from the institute side, Tavistock side, apart from a woman called Paddy Daniel, who is a child analyst, or later became a child analyst, social worker by background, and she was on the staff. And it was a meeting when Bruce Reid and Barry Palmer, who was also on the staff, wanted to introduce an innovation, which was that staff would work on in reflecting after events, the large study group and the small study group. They would work together, trying to build hypotheses about what was happening, but build a hypothesis which they would then present to the members at the start of the next session. And this caused havoc. Because there was violent disagreement amongst the staff. But Paddy Daniels felt it was a betrayal of the method. Andrew Schmidler somewhat stood on the fence. Bruce and Barry were very pro it. So there was a question about whether, because it was clear that some staff were not going to do it in the small study groups, would staff just develop the hypotheses but not present them at all, or would they, as it were, would some staff present and some eventually decided not to present at all, although the option was open if there seemed to be an opportunity where it looked useful. But I can remember working in the large study group meetings after the groups with Bruce and Andrew Schmidler, very much trying to, as it were, create a hypothesis that potentially we could offer to the members. I can't remember whether we did or not. It was like Leicester, but no, it's different from Leicester, it was much staider, but it was fairly explosive because there was a psychotic member that appeared shouting about people taking off their clothes at breakfast coming in one morning, and Jean Hutton had to, as it were, calm her down, and she couldn't go into sessions. Bruce had to see her. The local doctor was approached. She eventually sort of left. It was discovered that she'd been fairly psychotic in the past, etc., etc., etc. But Paddy Daniel felt that it was a sign of the lack of safety brought about by the changes that were being introduced. So it caused pretty much turmoil within the conference. And I was uneasy, that was the first time really, uneasy at the way Bruce directed, which was incredibly dominant and domineering, never letting go of his particular conception or his particular point. So you felt you were in the grip of something fairly, not just authoritarian, it was something more strong.
Control?
Yes, well, very controlling and very, self-serving only in the sense that it was self-serving Bruce's view of the world. And then later, as I worked, because I continued then in the TAFI and in the Grupp, and began working as a consultant more. I was then doing group relations conferences regularly. I don't think there was a Grupp conference that I ever missed, either on the staff or then in the later 80s, because Bruce always directed. Nobody except Bruce would direct a Grupp conference.
For how many years?
I would say something like that. Very similar to when, I suppose, in the days when Ken Rice was directing. Even Eric, come to that. Eric Miller, for years, was directing Talmud. So. And then it was clear that I think Bruce realised that it was just avoiding something. And that's when I'd written a bit in those days, that's when he suggested, or the Grupp meet staff together suggested that would I be willing to direct the next Grupp conference, which I did. But the proviso was that Bruce would be on the staff. And of course, nothing could be worse and it was an absolutely horrendous experience in a way, and I learned a lot from it. But Bruce constantly interfering, constantly as if trying to tell you what decision you should take, and as against my judgment or in some other staff. So staff were in some uncertainty. Who's directing this conference? Is it Bruce or is it Armstrong? And
did you invite staff more from his
background?
background?
No. They were from they were mixed. They were from the Tavistock and the Grub, basically, and Evelyn Cleveland. So I'd done some work with a small group in the London Psychotherapy Centre, working regularly, and that's where I met Evelyn. So Evelyn was there, Tim Dartington, and a number of, I can't remember now, other people, and then people from the Grub. And it came to a head when there was Bruce had wanted, it hadn't been anticipated that it took place across a Christian festival. I can't remember which one it was now. And no arrangement had been made about this, and he wanted a change in the programme. This was when the conference was already being held, that would enable vicars to celebrate this, that, or the other. A bit like what's his name. And I violently opposed it. I'm not violently is perhaps too strong. I certainly felt violently inside. I refused to give way, and was then joined by staff. So Bruce muttering inside himself. And I'm not sure whether there wasn't some kind of compromise about putting a little notice on the board saying blah blah blah. Then I was beginning to work with in what they called organisational role analysis, with executives in the private sector, public sector, voluntary sector, fairly stuff-wide. So it might be head teachers, because there were quite a lot of those around at the time, people, psychologists sometimes, social workers, but also industrialists. I worked with people from the banking world, both multinational and UK-based. And some people from the heavy industry, and there were bits and pieces of action research in the private sector, particularly with an electrical company in Croydon, part of a multinational that Bruce had been very involved with, and then in Ireland with the Irish version of Yellow Pages that he did a lot of work on. But what, so that, I was there 16 years at the Grub. And the reason I left, it wasn't initially my doing at all. Gordon had joined the Grub. Lawrence, yes. This would be in about 1980, maybe 1987 or 8 or something like that. And he had set up with us, and he and I really worked together on it, but Bruce came into the first one. Social dreaming workshops, the first social dreaming workshops would be held at Wasfield's house in Birmingham. And because I had always felt Gordon was a rather threatening figure, but I got very close to Gordon. And I loved social dreaming, that's the first occasion. And I think the way I worked must have fitted in with Gordon's concept in some way, whereas I think Bruce struggled tremendously with this, because Bruce was he'd never been in analysis. And obviously he'd read a lot of analytic stuff, but he always stood really rather outside it. So the whole thing was, we had to really persuade him to, as it were, that we should do it. And they went on for about 6 years, but no, it can't be as long as that. Because what then happened was that Gordon fell out badly with it, partly because, for all his many qualities, although I saw it from Gordon's point of view, not Bruce's, Gordon had great difficulty in bringing in money. He was a very, very poor marketer. If stuff came up, he could do it, but the amount of work that he could bring in directly was always being very limited. And the one bit of work that he did have beforehand was a major bit of work in France with a marketing company. He did privately. So
and he was a full-time member
yes,
of the Grupp.
he was.
So he had
Yes.
to bring some.
So there were violent sort of arguments eventually as Gordon became more and more unhappy with what was happening, and the Grupp split into really two camps. A camp of people, it was really the relatively newer people, I think, who were very much aligned with Gordon, and the original group of the Grupp that were aligned primarily with Bruce, and then one or two in between people. So it was very uncomfortable. And this ought never to be disclosed, but eventually, effectively, Bruce bought Gordon out. So, and that's, I was extraordinarily distressed at the time. And then I'd begun writing quite a bit, and got, again, whenever you wrote, I mean, this was the trouble around John, you always had to have these endless arguments with Bruce about what you were saying. He was always trying to get you to turn it around and say, no, you can't say that, or no, that's surely wrong. Or, and I began to get, so I only wrote by writing entirely independently, never showing anything to Bruce, and just sending it out to this or that place. Because I'd become more interested in the link between, not so much theoretical, but the link between psychoanalytic practice and organisational work. And what interested me was, is there a kind of analogue to the psychoanalytic setting if you're working organisationally, and how does one understand that? And if you're working one-on-one, how do you understand it? Where obviously you're working with a more sort of systemic construct, not as a construct of the inner world of the individual, but how do you sort of see that in terms of the process of the sort of session and what you're working with? And it's out of that the idea of organisation in the mind gradually develops, because organisation in the mind was very much, I think it was first introduced by Pierre Turquet in a Leicester conference setting in relation to the large study group. But
the concept of organisation.
Yes, I think that's where it originates. And Bruce was very taken with it, but he worked with it as a kind of mental construct. I'd be conscious it might have unconscious elements too, which people sort of build of how they understand the organisation. Whereas I began to see it not so much as a mental construct, but as a kind of physical, if you learn now, or psychic presence, i.e. something of the emotional world of the organisation infects the individual entering it, whether they choose to or not. It's not just a construct. It's a kind of lived mental element within them, in a sense, that is picked up from the way in which things happen organisationally, or from the nature of the task that the organisation carries, or the structure, or what's happening in the context, etc. So there's that sort of slight difference in a way, and that's what it emerged originally out of work with a number of individual clients, a head teacher, the chairman of the Special Hospital Service Authority, which runs the mental hospitals for convicted criminals in the UK, and one or two other people. That's what first put me on the... Anyway, so that was happening. And then Bruce, getting, of course, old, really wanted, I'm not quite sure why, to the Grupp to return to its more Christian foundations. So he began getting interested in the sort of theological concerns or theological ideas, and what they might add to or counterpoint to a kind of group relational perspective. So he was thinking of bringing in theologically knowledgeable people into the field, and seeing whether there was a way of working at the interface between theological and psychological or analytic ideas within a group relation setting, and also trying to underscore the Christian element within the Grupp's founding years. And although, I mean, my whole background has been deeply Christian as a child, etc., and it's very much inside me in all sorts of ways, I'm not, I'm not a religious myself. I'm not a sort of believer in that sense. I'm certainly not a Christian any longer. Not that I'm anything else either. So and I began to get uneasy because when I joined the Grub, this issue we discussed, and I said, no longer really a Christian orientation. Though I wasn't a kind of what's the term? Proselytizing atheist either. I can remember that's a phrase that somebody in the Grub conference once said when the issue of religious belief came up. He said, "Well, I'm a proselytizing atheist." And it was fine in those days because the Grub really had moved very much towards operating, I think led partly by Rice, operating within a sort of a very straight, what we now call as system psychodynamics perspective. There's one thing that's relevant, because I think it's sometimes where we may be in slightly different places, that I did, after a while, again this is later on in the Grub experience, get a little bit uneasy about the way in which Bruce always, it was almost a kind of mantra, and also an objection to all sorts of other things, always raised the question of systemic. So that if there was no way of seeing anything other than systemic, and it became burdensome after a while. So I think that was also probably an element. Anyway, what it meant was that in 93 or 4, maybe 94, so seriously, my mother, was 90, in her 90s, and she'd had a stroke, and it was dreadful in a way because she could never really recover. She couldn't speak. She looked increasingly, in a world where nothing could be communicated. So you didn't even know what was happening inside her, even when you saw her. She was in a home at the time, and she developed gangrene in her foot and her bottom leg, which was terribly, terribly painful. And in 94, when my twin was with her, she died. And it had an enormous effect on me, although I always have been very close to her, although we moved in different worlds entirely in later life. And I'm not sure I could say exactly what lay behind what I felt. I was very, very strongly affected. And it made me remember something of my, I've always been struck by my parents. Although I don't share their belief, the courage and the faith with which, my mother can't have been more than 22 or 3, from just a kind of very ordinary lower middle class farming marketing background, as it were, suddenly decides to be a missionary and to go out to the Gold Coast to set up infant schools in villages in the north of the country. This was been
in Africa.
Yes, in the 1920s, late 1920s, early 30s. And my father went out, and he was a bank clerk to begin with, and then trained as a Methodist minister. And he went out immediately after he was in the vacation in 1914 from Liverpool to the Gold Coast.
Where they met.
That's where they met and were married. Now. But it was something, when I was in analysis, because my analyst was Jewish, and I can remember maybe saying something about this at one time, and I think, although he was Jewish, what he extraordinarily, you can't say good, shrewd, at the way in which he would see something of the importance and the value of faith or belief associated with my parents, or with Methodism generally in a sense, and how that might be sort of understood in terms of what was happening to me. So it was when I was in analysis, curiously, that I rediscovered how important my not just my upbringing, but as it were, the ideas or values of my parents were, even if I might see them in an entirely different way. That might have been around. And the other thing around was I thought, well, with the death of my mother, I needed to just not to carry on, as if in a place where I was feeling increasingly uncomfortable. I shouldn't just sort of carry on as if there was no alternative, and it would put me in a kind of false position. And then, out of the blue, John Stokes asked whether we could have dinner, and said the clinic is going to set up a dedicated consultancy service to try and Manny's always very upset when one says this, but Manny wasn't at the Institute at the time, to try to get the return to the founding traditions of the Institute, linked, as they saw it, in sort of psychoanalytic and emerging out of psychoanalytic practice, and set it up within the clinic as a quasi-autonomous, in the sense there would be no money to support it other than the money that it generated from sort of client work or training or whatever. It was going to be John, Claire Huffington, William Holton, and a guy called Alan Bacon, who'd been a student of Elliot Jack's and was in a slightly different ball game actually. He said, would I be interested in exploring the possibility of joining? Now I think actually Gordon had had a word with him beforehand that I was a bit unsettled, and I didn't know this at the time. And I thought, extraordinary, it comes out of the blue, something that offers me exactly, in a sense, what I think I want, returning to a slightly more psychoanalytically based institution in a way, and also an institution where I'd feel far freer as one of the kind of almost like the core staff at the very beginning, because I was very, not close to, but I very much liked John Stokes. So that's what led me to and all sorts of chaos when I said to colleagues that I was going to leave. John, who was then sort of heading up the sort of staff group, was incredibly upset. Bruce, and actually Bruce handled it well. I mean, he was certainly put me under pressure to sort of reconsider, but he was he would argue this, that, and the other, but he was basically, I think, fairly.
Yeah, two girls.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, Jean was upset, and I have to say that although I mean, I joined it in 1994. I came back to the Tabby, and I really loved it in a way. I mean, it's particularly in the early days when we were in the same building, because now later we had to move to an annex because they wanted to free up space for clinical work. And so when we were on the same floor as the adult department, and I very quickly got to know many of the sort of key players around, partly because I knew Anton quite well. Anton was extremely helpful in some way, because he would say, I can remember going to see him once and saying I was a little bit uneasy that I wasn't sort of taking on management responsibilities, and was I burdening other people with it. And he said, no, we didn't bring you in to take on management responsibilities. We brought you in to do your own sort of thinking and work.
Antonopoulos.
Yes. So he wouldn't have said it in that kind of a way, because he's much more sort of light touch than that. So I felt I was given an awful lot of sort of free rein, and there was quite a bit of work. So I brought in quite a bit of work from the Grub, and we had to pay Grub a proportion of the money. And then there were contacts I'd had in the Grub, like Erica Stern, who were inviting me to do different things in Holland or Israel or Bulgaria, because I worked in Bulgaria for about 4 years. Conferences. So, and then there was quite a bit of sort of one-to-one work and other sorts of work too, and I've really, really enjoyed it, despite the continuous, it's a bit like your notion of waves, but I think I find it interesting to understand how this happens, you know, the ways in which you somehow reach a point where it's never occurred to me to leave, nor did it occur to me when I eventually decided to retire that I would simply go working privately. No, I always felt I would work as an associate with TCS and continue the link. So I'm very committed to it, even though I do strongly feel now that the splitting of sort of Tavistock-oriented institutions or concern between, I mean, the Institute, the Grub, TCS, Opus, is really dire, because it means you can never develop any critical mass. So, you know, people are competing for the same sort of constituency of work very often without any real chance to develop them. It's quite different in the early days of the Tavistock. Anton, interestingly, had tried to bring about a merger between, he was interested in sort of a merger between the Institute and TCS, but there was resistance in the clinic. Yes, this was after he left. And there was at some time resistance, to be fair, in TCS too. And I think the Grub was felt to be too Christian by half. It was a bit okay, that's slightly sort of unfair, although I still feel that the faith bit of the Grub's work is problematic as far as I'm concerned. I'm not saying this, it's not perfectly reasonable to go down that route. But it's interesting how, and because it's a pattern that repeats. I mean, in the Institute goes on for about how long from its foundation? Not perhaps 10 years, nearly 10 years, not quite. And then you get the first split. And then once that split happens, of course, everything begins dissolving, because Eric goes to the States permanently, Eric Trist.
Eric Trist, and
yeah.
He went also first to States?
Yes, and lived there for the rest
So
of his life. Ken, but Ken was always UK based.
Okay.
Eric and Beulah, his wife, left and went to the States and lived in the States, but he never came back.
Yeah.
No, he went to Canada. Well, he came back, on visits.
Yes, of course, but
No. And both said, that was the Centre for Applied Social Research at Philadelphia, was profoundly influenced by Eric Trist. And Jim Krantz was too. He was at Philadelphia with Russ Akoff for a long time, having originally been, I think, in California and or Los Angeles, and found that quite an uncomfortable experience. And then later he moved to Canada. And then Emery went back to Australia. Girth Higgin came to Leicester as a professor. Alex Pollock went into private practice as an analyst. So you had a feeling of the whole thing just sort of, in a way, fragmenting, in a sense. And then, although it's covered by this, you pick up in the first volume of the Tavistock Ontology, the introduction, it's covered by the idea of kind of a network of people, which included, of course, people in Europe, and then people in the States, and people in Australia. But the network is a slightly amorphous, loose construct, I think, at that time.
Well, when you direct conferences, David, well, what is important from your point of view, directing a conference?
It's a very interesting question. Well, the first thing that's important for me is not to dominate the conference in terms of my own sense of what needs to happen. I tend to think that the role of director is not so much to be within the conference, the sort of creative spirit, but to create a framework with which staff have the maximum opportunities to be creative, something like that. So that's certainly one thing. But there is a second thing, which is my what's important to me is really something about the spirit of the method. In other words, I'm really much less interested in changing this and changing that. I'm much more interested in remaining with the kind of core of the method as I see it. And so that the creativity becomes more the kind of, I suppose I could say more the emotional and conceptual creativity rather than the creativity in terms of doing things differently all the time. So, I mean, it's why, in a way, a bit very sceptical, and perhaps when I was feeling at my worst, slightly huffy about things like music in plenaries, trying to introduce more sort of psychodrama or whatever, yoga events. Now, last year I shifted a little bit because I thought the yoga event was really useful, actually, and I still think that. Some of the other innovations, and they are interesting, I'm quite willing to work with them, but I'm yet to be convinced that they add something really importantly new conceptually in ways. Because I feel that there's a tendency for group relations to have conceptually to have got stuck in as it were, and this is what I think was so interesting in Trist's writing, his feeling that Beaumont is made into a kind of cult. Group relations can too easily become a kind of cult in which one's constantly, as it were, going over the same ground rather than, I think there have been developments, but not as many conceptually as there might have been. So I think trying to create a framework which, as far as possible, enables people to work creatively within that framework rather than constantly mess about with the framework in order to be creative. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit.
But then it becomes clear.
Yes.
Yeah. But when you say the core, what is the core for you, the core of the methodology?
Well, I think the core, first of all, it's working in the here and now. Secondly, it's working within a very clear work boundary in terms of time, territory, task, etc., all that kind of stuff. That's core for me. Thirdly, working with countertransference. That's, I think, absolutely cool for me. But fourthly, working with the countertransference in a way that is always linked to the notion of, well, I don't mind which it's called really, the organisation or the system in the mind. Now, I'm not averse to exploring the more sort of personal dynamic. I think that's really important, but I think that needs to be understood in relation to something like what's evoking that from, as it were, the boundary of the system and its context in which the conference is framed. Being able to see what happens in the inner world of the conference in relation to the outer context from which people come and which therefore inevitably are brought in. It's as if the outer context is introduced into the conference from outside instead of discovered from inside.
Very interesting. I see. You were talking about countertransference. Can you say a few sentences about it?
Well, what I'm thinking of is the way in which you begin to pick up feelings, it might be images, etc., that are unexpected, that you don't think of as something that you would necessarily be on the lookout for. You pick them up inside yourself, but then begin to wonder, I wonder what is this saying or telling me about, as it were, the systemic world that is operating here, or I'm saying the organisation, the mind that's operating here, that I'm suddenly becoming aware of. I mean, I think the important, because you might, within a small group setting, it might more be, what is the way, what am I picking up about the way in which, for example, I myself am being seen here, and what's the why clause of that? That might do that, I think. So it's not so much, I think the difficulty is the ease with which, because of more recent analytical work, I suppose not all that more recent actually, one tends to blur the distinction between the counter-transference in terms of what we or I are imposing on the members by introducing, which is to do with stuff I haven't sort of processed inside myself, and counter-transference in the sense of what you're alert to inside yourself that looks as if it's been, as it were, projected from the membership. And I think it's very difficult sometimes to distinguish between. So it's almost as if the members are having to deal with the counter-transference of staff rather than the other way round. And partly even historically blurred was a more recent historical experience. And B, the organisational relevance tended to get blurred because it was covered by the societal stuff.
And if you invite staff, what is important for you as a director? How do you look? What do you look at? What is important?
Well,
staffing. So to say.
In terms of staffing, I would always. I've got to be slightly careful. I mean, I'd always, in conferences like this that had a kind of international constituency that they're addressing, I think I would always feel it's really important to have a kind of internationally based staff. It's an obvious point in a way. I would always also, I think, feel that I would want to try and recruit a core of staff that were, if I'm certainly thinking of Leicester, that were pretty experienced. I'm not averse to bringing in much younger people, but I think it's risky to bring in too many.
For the membership and for the whole world.
Yes, and I've always also been interested in bringing in the people that have had training or come into group relations from slightly different perspectives, or certainly slightly different institutional bases, whether this is OFEC or AK Rice or I'm sure yes, India I have, of course, Jewish people, or the Tavistock or whatever that. The other thing that is I would always want is I'd always want to bring in somebody that really has sustained experience in psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic therapy. So I'd always want to bring in somebody, a practitioner from that basis. And I'd always want to bring in somebody that comes from a primarily systemic background. So those, I think, are true. I would also prefer, I mean, just the number of these people is reducing in a way. I'd also prefer sometimes to bring in somebody that wasn't just in the business of developing group relations or whatever. Somebody who wasn't primarily a group relations professional. And that might be, I mean, analysts who don't practice group relations as part of the profession but have an interest in it and have experience in it. Or it might be businessmen. Yeah, absolutely, yes. I think that in a way, the number of those people that come into staff has seriously reduced. So, which I think tends to increase the feeling you sometimes have of working with a kind of rather an in-group staff membership.
The role of an associate director, what is the importance of this for you if you direct?
Well, it's been very important. I mean, when I directed the in-house conferences at the TAVI, and William Holton worked with me as director, and later Deirdre Moylan, I think in terms of sharing ideas beforehand, also in terms of somebody that's able to say, oh, you wait a minute, why are you doing this or why are you doing that? You can bring in a slightly different perspective, and I think who can head up one sort of major strand of the work. I mean, I know that it's I think too often probably nowadays the tendency is for the directors to say, well, director and associate director must both go into the large study group. I really don't quite see why, and I think there's something to be said for having an associate director convening the small study group system. because then it means that the directorate have got access when they meet
to both
whereas
subsystems.
now they haven't got access to the small study, and because we don't, the amount of feedback one can give in the small study group has tended to get squeezed out rather. They're working with only sort of one segment of their...
That's what we do normally in Germany most of the time, to bring the associate to the small study.
I've always also, well, this isn't what Mary's done here, of course. I haven't usually wanted to work or preferred working, not in the in-house conference, but elsewhere, working with somebody from another nationality.
As an associate
director, yes, yes. I've not, yes, I mean, it might be somebody, do I think about different, I'm just trying to think of it. I've certainly worked with Jewish directors. I've never worked, I don't think I've ever worked with a black associate director. In fact, I'm certain I haven't.
In terms of race?
Yes, so that element I haven't experienced of. But for example, when I was asked by Erika to direct the Group Relations Netherlands conferences for 3 years, shortly after that was founded, and I always worked with her as the associate director. I think if you're working internationally from outside the country, particularly if it's a country that, well, of course in the Dutch speak English perfectly, but a country that's using another language, you must work with an associate director from within the society.
If you implement social dreaming matrix in a group relations conference,
well,
it's one of your favorites.
Well, I really quite, although I very, very interested and keen on the idea of social dreaming, I think it can be problematic in conferences where you've been in a conference where they had a social dreaming matrix, which I've done in Australia twice, I think. I think that the risk of it is that it tends to rob particularly the large study group, of the dream material. Because it's as if the dream material is explored within the matrix and it's somehow taken out of the other events. I think that's like, I think here last year when one set up that social dreaming matrix in the societal event, that was slightly different ball game, because originally it was set up because we got all these dreams that had been shared elsewhere in the conference, and in the design event we put some of those up, if you remember, on that flip chart and take the creative room. So that was you had a setting in which that seemed an appropriate thing to do, but to do it as it were as a kind of planned event, I think would be a mistake. And it's not like, I mean, in Australia, Alistair had a social dreaming matrix, and then he also had a social dreaming matrix, and also a community meeting. So you got far too much stuff.
What is it, a community meeting?
Well, it was just when people came together at the very beginning of a day, and he would say something like, are there any issues in the community that need to be addressed?
For half an hour or something like that.
Yes, that's right.
Like reflecting.
It might be administrative stuff, it might be reflecting stuff. Yeah, it was right. But so I'm not totally. The other trouble about social dreaming matrix, I think, is that there are qualifications to this. That often when it's introduced in conferences, not all staff take part, of course. It's not a whole staff event. So
just the convener, right?
Yes, absolutely, two conveners or whatever.
Why two?
Well, I think Gordon, I've done it with singles, convener. But I think to have two gives you again sort of double associative perspectives in a way. So I think that is really useful. Incidentally, that's one other thing that I do think is something that I think is important, has become important to me in group relations conferences, which is working more associatively. I mean, I don't always, in, let's say, a large study group, or even in a small study group, the lesser in there, I don't always just offer some sort of interpretative statement. I quite often would sort of associate to what somebody has said.
To the associate.
Yes.
What is the primary task of a social dreaming matrix? What would you say?
Well, it's simply, very simply stated, to share and associate to the dreams made available within the matrix, in order to explore the links between them and their meaning.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Gordon adds all sorts of other stuff about, in order to, as it were, liberate new thoughts and new thinking, something like that. But I've always thought that the primary task is to work with the dreams and the associations between the two dreams and explore the links that exist between them and what they may be saying about, as it were, the worlds from which people come.
You said within the social dreaming matrix, right? Not within the conference?
Well, that's how usually it's been stated, within, yes. And you could, and I think when we did it last year in the Sustainable Society event, it was, we said something about what these might be sort of representing fractally of the world, of the world of the conference as a fractal of the wider society.
And the role of the convener, or how would you describe the role?
I think the role of the convener is to hold the space, to in a way that supports the work of association without letting people get into what's much more a kind of group relations event, a here and now event, because that's the risk always in a social dreaming, that people just begin trying to dreams in terms of, as it were, what they're saying about the sort of group relational world. And Gordon's always been very clear that social dreaming is not a kind of group event. And so the relation, although there will be transferential stuff, including transferential stuff in relation to the consultants, it's not to be worked with directly, it's not to be backgrounded.
And do you share as a convener also dreams or not?
Yes. No. Well, I think it varies. I think you don't come in ordinarily sharing dreams, because it just gets in the way of the members sharing it, and then become a preoccupation maybe with the host's dream. But certainly there are occasions where I think one does share a dream because it somehow powerfully comes to mind in association to other dream material. And I think that maybe that's the difference, because I mean, very often people share dreams that they've had and maybe written down during the night, as it were, etc. Whereas I think the convener would only to share a dream if it's so, in his mind, so powerfully comes into view as an association to another dream. And then I think you might.
What about if skipping the large study group and instead bringing the social dreaming matrix?
Well, but the large study group is a very, very, I think you always think it's a very important event.
So there is something missing of the basics.
The
core of what you said.
Yes, I think the large study group is because it evokes, I mean, so often the more sort of frightening undertone of. It's not always true. I mean, one can exaggerate that, but I think it does. And it's not just a frightening undertow, it's also about, because I think it's about, in the large study group, very powerfully evokes, in my view, the multitude of aspects of people's internal worlds. That's what's so frightening. And we say we're frightened by the group process itself, or what X is doing or Y is doing, but really I think the fear is about that bit in oneself, the bully in oneself, to give an example from here.
Very much. Thank you very much, David.
No.
Great to talk to you. We can learn a lot from you.
Well,
how to direct, how to set up, how to be a staff member. Yes.